Welcome to United States History, to 1877, Chapter 11, The Cotton Revolution. In this lecture, you will learn the following information. 1. Demand for cotton made the American South prosperous and wealthy. 2. The South used technology and trade to preserve slavery. 3. The Southern population, slave and free, increased dramatically. 4. Cotton became cultural, so preserving slavery was essential to the Southern lifestyle. 5. American capitalism, North and South, encouraged the brutality of slavery. 6. Christianity was used to defend slavery. In the 30 years leading up to the Civil War, from 1830 to 1860, the American South experienced a time of dramatic change and growth, becoming more wealthy and developing as a center for the global market in cotton. As this change took place, the South sought to preserve its slavery tradition. Its culture was based upon a slave economy that allowed for white supremacy in all aspects of the economy, politics, and society. The global cotton trade was transformed by changes in technology and in transportation. Eli Whitney's cotton engine, also called the cotton gin for short, made land for growing cotton in high demand. The cotton engine was able to remove the seeds from the cotton that was picked from the fields, reducing the amount of labor and shortening the time from harvest to complete product. This transportation and technology innovation allowed for more production, but made slavery more essential. More slaves were needed to pick and cultivate the cotton from the fields. Because the production was made easier by the cotton gin, more slaves were necessary to feed the cotton into the cotton engine. In this way, the growth of American capitalism, built upon the Cotton Revolution, led to the increased enslavement of more human beings through the use of technology. Ironic, because technology is often thought to make life easier, but in this instance, technology made life more miserable for millions of African slaves. The growth in demand for cotton led to an increase in demand for land to grow it. This led President Andrew Jackson to remove Native Americans from the American South in 1830. Andrew Jackson's removal of Native Americans by force, known as the Trail of Tears, can be remembered as another product of American slavery. Because of the lands taken by violence from Native Americans and sold off, new lands could be cultivated using slave labor. As a result of this, throughout the South, cotton production exploded. In 1793, for example, the southern states produced 5 million pounds of cotton in that year alone. By 1800, the state of South Carolina alone produced 6.5 million pounds of cotton. And by 1835, the entire South produced 500 million pounds of cotton. In 1860, when the Civil War began, the American South produced 2 billion pounds of cotton a year, making up 60% of the total exports for the United States economy. In this way, cotton was the foundation of the American economy, American capitalism, and at the root, American slavery made it all possible. The profitability of cotton led to a boom in the demand for slaves. Without slavery, there could be no cotton production. It is important to understand that the economy of the United States was built by the labor of African Americans more than any other group. In this map, you see in the darker regions the areas where slavery was most common. Slavery existed in the South since 1619, and by 1790, there were 650,000 slaves in the American South. Just Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee held all of these slaves. 20 years later, the number of slaves had nearly doubled to 1.1 million. In the time from 1790 to 1810, the growth of American slavery increased, even as the global slave trade ended. Cotton demand was the cause for this growth. Slaves would often be used to borrow money, as a slave owner could put them up as collateral to borrow money from a bank. To buy new land and to grow cotton, these slaves were then forced to work to produce the crop to pay off their master's loan. In this way, white Americans could become wealthy by doing little of the work themselves and using violence and brutality to build wealth for their family from the labor of enslaved African Americans. The Cotton Revolution was a time of capitalism, panic, stress, and competition. Planters expanded their lands, borrowed money to purchase slaves, extended credit from banks, and went deep into debt as they competed with their neighbors to get rich. The inhuman cost of slavery was the most tragic part of this story. Slaves felt the fear, the terror, the pain, and the heartbreak of violence towards themselves and the loss of their own children to the auction block. Southerners routinely broke up slave families, selling the women and the children away from their parents. Over time, a system of resistance and rebellion grew amongst the slaves. Examples of this might be simple acts of resistance such as the breaking of tools, the destruction of a wagon, or slowing down of the work production. Violence from their white masters was commonplace and brutal. In this photograph, we see evidence of the brutality of American slavery in the scars left on the back of a slave named Gabriel. In these images, we see evidence of American slavery's brutality in the slave collars that would often be worn by American slaves, put upon them by their masters. Seen on the right, we can see depiction of whites celebrating the American way while looking on to an African American enslaved in chains. Through minor injuries, running away, and even pregnancy, slaves were provided a language of silent resistance, understood by their fellow slaves everywhere. With nearly 4 million slaves in the South, the fear of violent resistance was always on the minds of white slave owners. White farmers, writers, merchants, and politicians expressed fear of slave revenge. Many slave owners saw slavery as their economic and social security system. Slavery ensured whites stayed wealthy and gave a system of social control over slaves who might otherwise rise up and kill their oppressors. Humanity had become a commodity in the South, bought and sold, and used to produce profit for a select group of investors. The culture of the South was nearly one-half slave culture. The concept of family was central to both blacks and to whites. However, family and community allowed for tradition, religious beliefs, and even names to be passed down from generation to generation that could defy even slavery. Slave marriages endured even in the threat of disruption through the sale of family members, as husbands, wives, and children were routinely separated by their white masters and sold off to work in new and distant, unknown plantations throughout the South. Hundreds of thousands of marriages, many with children, fell victim to sale at the auction block. The death of a master could see whole families sold off to faraway new owners, never to be seen again. Female slaves also suffered sexual violence and forced pregnancies at the hands of their owners. Religion and honor in the South was an essential part of the culture of the region. The Second Great Awakening established a strong religious culture in the South, led by Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians. Southern ministers argued that God Himself had selected Africans for slavery. Southern missionaries tried to convert slaves whenever possible, and Sunday church was one of the few times that slaves and whites could mingle together freely. Evangelical religion also shaped understanding of what it meant to be a Southern man or a Southern woman. Southern manhood was obsessed with honor, while Southern womanhood was defined by sexual purity and virtue. Evangelical religion also shaped understanding of what it meant to be a Southern man or a Southern woman. Southern manhood was obsessed with honor, while Southern womanhood was defined by sexual purity and virtue. Violent duels often settled disputes over honor and virtue in the South. Even though laws existed for crimes like murder, rape, and robbery, they were rarely applied to the wealthy white men, and juries often found rich white men not guilty. For women, sexual purity was a code of expectation born out of common white male sexual abuse of black women. Black men were seen by whites to be sexual predators, and racial stereotypes of violence existed for generations to keep Southern white women away from black men. In this lecture, we learned the following information. 1. The demand for cotton made the American South wealthy and prosperous. 2. The South used technology and trade to preserve slavery. 3. The Southern population, both slave and free, increased. 4. Cotton became cultural, so preserving slavery was essential to the Southern lifestyle. 5. American capitalism encouraged the brutality of slavery. 6. Christianity was used to defend slavery. This has been United States History to 1877, Chapter 11, The Cotton Revolution, created with work from the American Yawp, an open-source U.S. history textbook published by Stanford University, edited by Joseph Locke and Ben Wright, with narration and comments from myself, Tyler Rust, for History Dojo.